I still remember the sound of rain against my apartment door that night, sharp and insistent like fingers drumming impatiently. It was past 11, the kind of hour when unexpected visitors usually bring bad news. But when I opened it, Julian stood there dripping onto my hallway carpet, hair plastered dark against his forehead, that same crooked grin I'd been trying to forget for 15 years. He looked exactly the same and completely different, older around the eyes, broader through the shoulders, but still carrying himself like the world owed him something beautiful. He held an old canvas duffel bag in one hand, the kind we'd used in college when everything we owned could fit into 2 trips to the car. Water pooled at his feet like he'd walked through the storm just to find me, like he'd stepped out of some half-remembered dream where people actually came back instead of just disappearing into their adult lives. "Only one bed," he said, and there it was, that teasing lilt in his voice that used to make our dorm room feel too small, the same tone he'd used when he'd steal the last slice of pizza or convince me to skip class for another terrible movie marathon. The words hung between us and my cramped doorway, casual as breathing, but they hit me like a physical thing. I felt something crack open in my chest, something I'd spent years carefully sealing shut with work and routine and the safe distance of unanswered phone calls. I forced out a laugh, the kind that sounds hollow even to your own ears, and told him he was lucky I was generous. But even as I said it, I could feel the heat creeping up my neck, that old familiar flush that betrayed every careful wall I'd built since college. I turned away before he could see it, before he could read the truth written across my face like it had always been. My apartment stretched out behind me, boxes still unpacked 3 months after moving in, their contents a testament to a life I kept meaning to fully commit to. Half-finished canvases leaned against walls like abandoned conversations, their subjects staring out with eyes I'd never quite gotten right. Tubes of paint sat scattered across my desk, caps missing, colors dried to memory. The whole place felt suspended between who I used to be and who I was still trying to become. The single bed sat in the corner, suddenly enormous and impossible, a question I wasn't ready to answer. I'd bought it after David moved out, thinking it would help me sleep alone again, help me stop reaching across empty space in the dark. Now it seemed to mock me, this narrow mattress that had felt like freedom just months ago. "This is nothing," I told myself as Julian stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket. Just Julian being Julian. The same Julian who'd borrowed my sweaters in college and never returned them, who'd fallen asleep during late-night movies with his head on my shoulder, who'd always treated affection like currency he could spend without consequence. But my body remembered what my mind kept trying to forget, the weight of wanting someone who would never want you back, the particular ache of loving your best friend. The apartment felt smaller with him in it, the air thicker. He dropped his bag by the door and looked around, taking in my carefully controlled chaos, and I wondered what he saw. Whether he noticed the sketches I'd tried to hide, the ones where anonymous figures looked suspiciously like him. Whether he could sense how I'd been holding my breath for 15 years, waiting for a moment that would never come. That night, I lay awake beside him in the darkness, listening to the rain soften against the windows and wondering how many years of careful self-preservation could unravel in a single evening. He'd taken the left side without asking, the way he always had, settling in like he belonged there, like the 15 years between then and now had been nothing more than a brief intermission. The mattress dipped under his familiar weight, and I could smell his shampoo, something cedar and clean that hadn't changed since sophomore year. I pressed my back against the far edge of the bed, trying to create distance in a space that had none, but every accidental brush of his arm against mine felt like electricity, like touching a live wire with wet hands. He shifted in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't catch, and his knee bumped against my thigh. I held perfectly still, barely breathing, afraid that any movement might wake him and force us both to acknowledge what we were pretending wasn't happening. I stared at the ceiling and tried to convince myself this was temporary, that Julian would leave in a few days, return to whatever life he'd built without me, slip back into the careful mythology I'd constructed around our friendship. But lying there in the dark, close enough to count his heartbeats, I knew something fundamental had shifted. The door I'd spent years keeping closed was opening again, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to shut it this time. Or worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. Morning came gray and ordinary, the way mornings always did in my apartment. I woke to find Julian already gone, his side of the bed cool and empty, the impression of his body the only evidence he'd been there at all. For a moment, I wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing. Then I heard the shower running and smelled coffee brewing, and reality settled back around me like an old coat. I am 33 years old, and my life fits into routines small enough to manage. Freelance illustration work that pays just enough to keep the lights on. Morning coffee that I drink alone while staring out at the fire escape, watching pigeons navigate the narrow spaces between buildings. Gray studio light that filters through windows I never quite remember to clean. My phone sits on the counter, displaying 3 missed calls from my mother that I'll return when I feel strong enough to explain why I'm still single, still struggling, still living like someone half my age. The apartment feels different with Julian in it, like a museum suddenly brought to life. I moved here 3 months ago, after David finally admitted what we both knew, that our relationship had been built on comfort rather than desire, safety rather than love. We'd lasted 4 years, which felt like an accomplishment until it started feeling like a sentence. He was kind and stable and everything I thought I wanted, but lying next to him night after night, I felt like I was holding my breath underwater. On my desk sit framed prints from art school, faded now and curling at the edges, figure studies and still lives that earned me decent grades but never felt like mine. Professor Martinez always said I had talent but lacked conviction, that my work was technically sound but emotionally distant. What I could never tell him was that the work that mattered lived hidden in sketchbooks tucked under my mattress, in margins of textbooks, in desperate late-night drawings that I'd tear up before anyone could see them. How do you explain that the person you most want to paint would never understand why they appeared in sketch after sketch, their face emerging from charcoal and graphite like a prayer you're afraid to say out loud? I drew Julian's hands more times than I could count, long fingers wrapped around coffee cups, gesturing as he talked, resting on my shoulder during those rare moments when he'd forget to maintain the careful distance that friendship required. I memorized the curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was concentrating, the particular shade of brown in his eyes that changed depending on the light. Julian was always the golden boy, even back then. I remember watching him across crowded lecture halls, surrounded by people drawn to his easy confidence like moths to flame. Women found excuses to sit beside him, to laugh at jokes that weren't particularly funny, to touch his arm when they spoke. Sarah from our Victorian literature class once asked me if Julian was seeing anyone, as if I were some kind of oracle who could divine the mysteries of his romantic life. Men either wanted to be him or be around him, sensing something magnetic in the way he moved through the world like it owed him good things. I became expert at reading the signs. The way he'd lean back in his chair when Rebecca from our art history seminar would bat her eyelashes. How his smile would turn polite but distant when someone pushed too hard for his attention. He dated sporadically, never seriously, leaving a trail of hopeful hearts and unanswered texts. I told myself I was glad he never found anyone worth keeping, that it had nothing to do with the selfish part of me that wanted to remain his closest confidant. But it was the late nights I treasured most, when the parties wound down and everyone else stumbled back to their own rooms. Julian would find his way to our door with stories and stolen bottles of wine. We'd sit on my narrow bed, backs against the wall, talking until dawn crept through the windows and painted everything gold. He told me about his father's expectations, the pressure of being the son who was supposed to have it all figured out, the weight of being everyone's favorite person when you weren't sure who you really were underneath all that approval. I told him about art and loneliness and the peculiar ache of wanting things you couldn't name. He looked at me during those conversations with something that might have been tenderness, but I learned not to read too much into it. Julian was generous with his attention, the way some people are generous with money. It meant everything to the receiver and very little to the giver. When morning came, he'd slip back into his public self, the one who belonged to everyone and no one. And I'd be left wondering if those quiet hours had meant anything at all. Now he emerged from my bathroom, hair damp and skin flushed from the hot water, wearing clothes I'd forgotten he'd borrowed. A gray t-shirt that used to be mine, jeans that fit him better than they ever fit me. He moved through my space with casual ownership, opening cabinets to find mugs, checking the refrigerator like he lived here. Just for work, he said when I asked how long he'd be staying. Some consulting thing that could take a few weeks, maybe a month. His company was footing the bill for temporary housing, but you know how those corporate places are, sterile and depressing. He said it like staying with me was a favor he was doing for both of us, like his presence was a gift I should be grateful to receive. I told myself it was nothing, just Julian being Julian. But watching him settle into my morning routine, humming while he buttered toast, stealing glances at my unfinished paintings when he thought I wasn't looking, I felt 19 again. Felt that old familiar flutter in my chest, the one I'd spent 15 years trying to quiet. My carefully constructed adult life, the therapist appointments, the meditation apps, the hard-won peace with solitude, suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. The apartment became a pressure cooker of memory and unresolved tension. Every shared meal carried the weight of conversations we'd never had. Every accidental touch in the narrow hallway sent electricity up my spine. Julian's presence filled spaces I hadn't realized were empty, and I found myself both grateful and terrified, like someone who'd been living in darkness suddenly exposed to blinding light. He left traces of himself everywhere. A coffee mug in the sink with his lip prints still visible on the rim, the bathroom mirror fogged from his longer showers, the indent in my couch, where he'd fallen asleep watching late-night television. I caught myself lingering over these small evidences of his existence, like an archaeologist studying artifacts from a civilization I desperately wanted to understand. I watched him leaf through my sketchbooks when he thought I was working, saw him pause at drawings that came too close to truth. There was one in particular, a figure study I'd done from memory, supposedly anonymous but unmistakably him, and I held my breath as his fingers traced the edge of the page. But he never said anything, just closed the covers gently and moved on to something else, leaving me to wonder what he'd seen and what he'd chosen to ignore. The unspoken things between us grew heavier with each passing day, settling into corners like dust I couldn't quite reach, impossible to clean but too obvious to pretend weren't there. I began to understand that having Julian here wasn't just about sharing space. It was about sharing the weight of everything we'd never said, all the almosts and maybes that had accumulated over 15 years of careful friendship. My quiet life had been a kind of protection, a way of avoiding the questions I was afraid to answer. But Julian's presence made silence impossible, made every moment feel charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Julian settled into my life with the casual ease of someone who'd never learned that some spaces weren't meant to be shared. Within a week, his socks appeared in corners I'd forgotten existed, his coffee mug claimed permanent residence beside the sink, and the sound of him humming off-key show tunes while brushing his teeth became the soundtrack to my mornings. I found myself moving around him like a ghost observing the living, careful not to disturb the natural chaos he brought to my carefully ordered world. He had a way of making himself at home that was both endearing and maddening. The bathroom counter sprouted his toiletries like urban weeds, expensive cologne, electric razor, hair products I couldn't pronounce. His laptop colonized half my kitchen table, surrounded by work papers and empty coffee cups that multiplied faster than I could wash them. When I mentioned the mess, he'd flash that apologetic grin and promise to clean up, then get distracted by a phone call or a deadline and leave everything exactly where it was. But it was the small intimacies that undid me. The way he'd steal bites of whatever I was cooking, leaning over my shoulder to taste sauce from the wooden spoon. How he'd commandeer the television remote and somehow convince me to watch terrible action movies I'd normally avoid. His running commentary, making even the worst films bearable. The easy resurrection of old jokes from college, references to professors we'd mocked, stories we'd told 100 times, but somehow never tired of hearing. We fell into routines that felt both foreign and inevitable. Shared dinners where he'd tell me about his consulting work, something vague involving corporate restructuring that paid well enough to keep him traveling. Late-night conversations that picked up threads from 15 years ago, as if we'd simply paused mid-sentence and were finally ready to continue. He asked about my illustration work, flipped through my portfolio with genuine interest, suggested clients he knew who might need my services. It was dangerous, this domesticity. The way he'd appear in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, hair still messy from sleep, asking if I wanted eggs while he was making them anyway. How he'd sprawl across my couch in the evenings, legs stretched long and feet in my lap, reading work emails while I sketched nearby. The casual touches that came so naturally, his hand on my back when he passed behind my chair, fingers brushing mine when we both reached for the salt. I started to let myself believe in the possibility of permanence, even though he'd never said how long he'd stay. Started to imagine what it might be like if this weren't temporary, if Julian could be part of my quiet life indefinitely. The thought terrified and thrilled me in equal measure, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you weren't sure whether you wanted to step back or jump. 3 weeks in, he found the sketch I'd tried to hide. I'd been careless, distracted by a deadline, and left my sketchbook open on the coffee table while I answered a client call in the kitchen. When I returned, Julian was standing perfectly still beside the couch, staring down at the page with an expression I couldn't read. The drawing was unmistakably him, a figure study I'd done from memory, capturing the line of his shoulders as he'd sat reading the night before, the way shadows fell across his collarbone in the lamplight. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Then he smiled, but it wasn't his usual easy grin. Something careful lived in it, something that made my stomach clench with recognition. "You still draw me," he said, and there was wonder in his voice, or maybe something else entirely. He'd started to tease. I could see it in the quirk of his eyebrow, but then he looked at the sketch again and went quiet. Really quiet, in a way that made the apartment feel too small and too large all at once. I stammered something about figure studies, about needing practice with proportions, about how he just happened to be there. The words felt clumsy and insufficient, like trying to explain color to someone who'd never seen anything but gray. Julian nodded slowly, still looking at the drawing, and I wondered what he saw there that I'd never meant to reveal. He closed the sketchbook gently and set it aside, but something had shifted between us. I could feel it in the air, electric and strange, like the moment before a storm breaks. We didn't talk about it, but for the rest of the evening I caught him watching me with a different kind of attention, as if he were seeing me clearly for the first time in 15 years. The next morning, he brought up the trip we'd never taken. We'd planned it senior year, some half-formed idea about driving upstate to a cabin by a lake, just the two of us, before graduation scattered us to different cities and different lives. But then Julian got that internship in Boston, and I had my thesis exhibition to prepare, and the trip became one of those someday things that never quite materialized into now. "You never leave this place," he said over breakfast, stirring sugar into his coffee with the slow deliberation of someone working up to something important. "You're stuck, Caleb. When's the last time you went anywhere that wasn't the grocery store or your studio?" He wasn't wrong. My world had contracted over the years, become a careful orbit of familiar spaces and manageable routines. The idea of breaking that pattern, of spending days alone with Julian in some remote cabin, felt impossible and necessary in equal measure. "We should finally take that trip," he said, and his voice carried weight I wasn't sure how to interpret. "The cabin's probably still available. What do you say?" I looked at him across my small kitchen table, morning light catching the gold flecks in his eyes, and felt the last of my careful defenses begin to crumble. Whatever this was, friendship, something more, something different entirely, it was happening whether I was ready or not. The sketch had changed things, opened a door I'd been guarding for so long I'd forgotten what lay on the other side. I said yes before I could think better of it, and Julian's smile was like sunrise, warm and inevitable and impossible to look away from. The cabin sat perched on the edge of Mirror Lake like something from a postcard I might have sketched, but never believed could exist in real life. Julian had found it through some connection he had. A college friend's family place that sat empty most of the year, weathered cedar and wide windows that caught the afternoon light and threw it back across the water in fractured gold pieces. We arrived on a Friday afternoon in early October, the air sharp with the promise of winter, leaves beginning their slow surrender to gravity. I carried our bags inside while Julian stood on the dock, hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, staring out at the lake like he was trying to memorize it. The cabin was smaller than I'd expected, a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow kitchen, and a loft bedroom accessible only by a ladder that looked like it had been built sometime in the previous century. One bed, I thought, and felt that familiar flutter of panic and anticipation. The first 2 days passed in a blur of easy companionship that felt both nostalgic and dangerously new. We fell into rhythms that seemed choreographed by muscle memory. Julian making coffee while I cooked eggs, both of us reading in comfortable silence, the kind of shared space that felt like coming home to a place I'd never actually lived. We took long walks around the lake, kicking through piles of autumn leaves and talking about everything except the obvious weight that seemed to follow us like a shadow. Julian had brought beer. Good beer, the kind we couldn't afford in college, and we'd sit on the dock in the evenings, feet dangling in water so cold it made us gasp and laugh. He looked different here, away from the city and the weight of whatever professional persona he carried. His shoulders had lost their careful set. His smile came easier, and sometimes I'd catch him watching the light change on the water with an expression I'd never seen before, something peaceful and unguarded. On the third night, he suggested we swim. The water was shockingly cold, the kind of cold that steals your breath and makes you question every decision that led you to this moment. But Julian was already diving under, surfacing with a whoop of laughter that echoed across the lake, and I found myself following him deeper, past the point where I could touch bottom, past the point where retreat felt possible. We treaded water in the gathering dusk, and I tried not to think about how close we were, how the dim light made everything feel intimate and strange. Julian's hair was slicked back, water beading on his shoulders, and when he turned to look at me, I saw something in his expression that made my heart stutter against my ribs. "This is perfect," he said, and his voice carried across the water like a secret. Why did we wait so long to do this? I didn't know if he meant the swim or something larger, some pattern of avoidance we'd both perfected over the years. But standing there in water deep enough to drown in, I felt brave enough to almost ask. Almost. Later, wrapped in towels by the fire Julian had built, we sat closer than strictly necessary, shoulders touching, sharing warmth and silence in equal measure. The flames threw dancing shadows on the cabin walls, and I found myself studying Julian's profile in the flickering light, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he leaned forward to add another log. "You ever think we messed up?" he said suddenly, his voice quiet enough that I had to strain to hear it over the crackling fire. Not keeping in touch after graduation, I mean. We were so close, and then we just weren't. The question hung between us like smoke, dangerous and impossible to ignore. I wanted to ask what he meant by close. Wanted to know if he remembered those late nights in our dorm room the same way I did. If the weight of unspoken things had followed him through the years the way it had followed me. But fear won, the way it always did, and I just nodded and made some non-committal sound about how life gets complicated. He looked at me then, really looked, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the thin towel around my shoulders. The fire popped and settled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and for a moment the only sounds were the lake lapping against the dock and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. We climbed the ladder to the loft that night without discussing the obvious logistics, without acknowledging that the single bed meant we'd be sharing space the way we had in college, before I'd learned to be careful about proximity and touch. Julian fell asleep first, his breathing evening out into the steady rhythm I remembered from 1,000 nights spent listening, and I lay awake beside him, close enough to feel the heat from his skin, far enough away to maintain the illusion of distance. Back in the city, something had shifted between us. Some invisible line had been crossed and redrawn. Julian seemed to linger longer during glances, his eyes following me across rooms with an intensity that made my skin feel electric. He'd touch my back when passing behind my chair, fingers trailing just long enough to feel deliberate. Sometimes I'd catch him staring when he thought I wasn't looking, his expression unreadable but weighted with something that made my breath catch. He started asking questions that felt like explorations, casual inquiries that carried more significance than their simple words suggested. "You ever been in love?" he asked one evening while we were cooking dinner together, standing close enough that I could smell his cologne, feel the warmth radiating from his body. The question should have been easy to deflect, but something in his tone made honesty feel inevitable. I told him about David, about the 4 years of comfort that had never quite become passion, about the way I'd felt like I was holding my breath underwater, waiting for something that never came. I told him more than I'd meant to, about the loneliness that came from being with someone who cared about you but would never truly see you, never understand the parts of yourself that mattered most. Julian listened without judgment, nodding at the right moments, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time, stirring pasta sauce with deliberate concentration. "What about you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. "Ever been in love?" He looked up then, and something flickered in his expression. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Once," he said, and his voice was soft enough that I had to move closer to hear. But I was too scared to do anything about it. The admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure either of us was brave enough to cross. I wanted to ask who, when, what had happened, but the questions felt too large for the small space we'd created. Instead, I turned back to the stove, heart hammering, and tried to pretend that everything hadn't just changed again. This part of my life became defined by almost moments. Almost touches when we'd reach for the same thing simultaneously, fingers brushing for seconds that stretched into eternity. Almost conversations when one of us would start to say something important, then lose courage and retreat into safer territory. Almost kisses when we'd find ourselves standing too close, the air between us charged with possibility, before one of us would step back and break the spell. I began to believe the impossible, that Julian might feel something too, that 15 years of careful friendship might be building towards something I'd never dared to hope for. But with every almost touch, every meaningful glance, I was also terrified that I was imagining it all, projecting my own desperate want onto innocent gestures. The line between hope and delusion felt thin as paper, and I wasn't sure which side I was living on. I woke to the sound of Julian moving around the apartment, but it was wrong somehow. Too careful, too deliberate, like he was trying not to wake me, but failing at silence. The bedside clock read 2:17 in the morning, and pale streetlight filtered through the blinds, painting everything in shades of gray and possibility. I lay still for a moment, listening, before I realized he wasn't just restless. He was drunk. I found him sitting on the living room floor, back against the couch, knees drawn up like a child trying to make himself smaller. An empty bottle of wine sat beside him, the good bottle I'd been saving, though I couldn't remember what I'd been saving it for. His hair was messed up, shirt wrinkled, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held something I'd never seen before. Not sadness, exactly, but something deeper and more complicated, like regret wearing the mask of resolution. "Can't sleep," he said, and his words carried the careful precision of someone trying very hard not to slur. His voice sounded strange in the quiet apartment, too loud and too soft all at once. I should have gone back to bed, should have made some joke about him raiding my wine collection and left him to work through whatever was bothering him alone. Instead, I sat down beside him on the floor, close enough to smell the alcohol on his breath, far enough away to maintain the pretense that this was normal, that finding your house guest drunk and lost at 2 in the morning was just another part of adult friendship. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The apartment felt different in the darkness, smaller and more intimate, like a confessional where secrets came easier than in daylight. Julian stared at his hands, turning them over like he was studying a map to somewhere he'd never been, and I found myself memorizing his profile in the dim light, the way shadows caught in the hollow of his cheek, the familiar line of his jaw that I'd drawn so many times but never quite gotten right. "I knew," he said suddenly, and the words hit me like cold water. "Back then. About you." Time stopped. I felt my chest constrict, felt the careful walls I'd built around this secret begin to crumble. He wasn't looking at me, was still staring at his hands like they might provide answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask, but I could feel the weight of confession settling between us like something physical and unmovable. "You think I didn't notice how you looked at me?" he continued, and now his voice was quieter, gentler, but somehow that made it worse. "All those late nights in our dorm room. The way you'd watch me when you thought I wasn't paying attention. The sketches you tried to hide, but never hid well enough." I couldn't breathe. 15 years of careful secrecy, of believing I'd been subtle, of convincing myself that my feelings were invisible, unraveled in the space of 2 sentences. I wanted to deny it, to maintain the fiction that had protected us both for so long, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat frozen, watching Julian's hand shake slightly as he reached for the empty wine bottle, then thought better of it. The confession felt both kind and cruel, like mercy and punishment delivered with the same breath. There was tenderness in his voice, recognition of something precious and painful, but also a distance that made it clear this was an ending rather than a beginning. He knew, had always known, and had chosen silence. Had chosen to let me carry this alone while he collected the comfort of my devotion without the responsibility of acknowledging it. "I didn't know what to do with it," he said, and finally looked at me. His eyes were glassy with wine and something else, something that might have been regret or might have been relief. "You were my best friend, Caleb. You were the most important person in my life, and I was terrified that if I acknowledged what I saw, what you felt, it would ruin everything between us." The irony was sharp enough to cut. By trying to preserve our friendship, he'd created the very distance he'd been afraid of. By pretending not to see, he'd made me feel invisible. All those years of wondering if I was imagining things, if I was projecting feelings that didn't exist, and he'd known all along. And now, I managed to ask, though my voice came out hoarse and strange, "What about now?" Julian was quiet for so long I began to think he hadn't heard me. When he finally spoke, his words were barely above a whisper. "Now I think I'm still a coward." He didn't back away when he said it, didn't retreat to safer distance the way he'd always done before. Instead, he leaned closer, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough to count his eyelashes. For a moment, suspended in wine and honesty and the strange intimacy of 3 in the morning, I thought he might kiss me. Thought 15 years of careful distance might finally collapse into something real and solid and mutual. But then he stopped, caught himself before crossing whatever invisible line he'd drawn between us. He stayed close, closer than friendship required, but didn't bridge that final gap. We hung there in the space between almost and not quite, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence, both of us afraid to move in any direction. He climbed into bed beside me that night, something we'd done 100 times, but never like this, never with truth hanging between us like a third presence. The mattress dipped under his weight, and I felt the heat from his body, smelled the wine on his breath mixing with his familiar scent. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling, and I turned onto my side, watching the rise and fall of his chest in the darkness. Neither of us slept. I could tell by the way his breathing never quite evened out, by the careful stillness of his body beside mine. We lay there for hours, close enough to touch, careful not to, both of us trapped in the space between what had been acknowledged and what remained unspoken. Every small movement felt magnified, the rustle of sheets, the shift of weight, the sound of breathing that seemed too loud in the charged silence. I wanted to reach for him, wanted to close the distance he'd created between knowing and acting, but his stillness kept me frozen. This wasn't an invitation, I realized. This was Julian processing his own fear, his own complicated relationship with desire and friendship, and the risk of losing something by trying to transform it into something else. Morning came gray and merciless, filtering through the blinds like a judgment we weren't ready to face. I woke to the sound of Julian moving around the apartment, but it was different from his usual casual chaos. There was purpose in it, efficiency, and when I finally got up to investigate, I found him packing. His suitcase lay open on the couch, clothes folded with military precision, toiletries already cleared from the bathroom counter. He moved with the careful determination of someone who'd made a decision in the dark hours before dawn, someone who'd chosen flight over the messier alternative of staying to face what had been revealed. We didn't talk about the night before. The morning felt too fragile for that kind of honesty, too bright and practical for the wine-soaked confessions that belonged to 3 a.m. and shadows. Instead, we moved around each other with polite distance, Julian packing with quiet efficiency while I made coffee I didn't want and tried to pretend my chest wasn't caving in. The apartment felt different already, like it was remembering how to be empty, how to hold just one person's worth of silence. Julian's presence had filled spaces I hadn't realized existed, and now they were closing again, contracting back to the manageable loneliness I'd convinced myself was peace. But something had changed irreversibly. The door between us had been opened, even if neither of us had been brave enough to walk through it. The coffee grew cold between us while Julian finished packing, each methodical fold of clothing another step toward the inevitable goodbye I'd been dreading since the moment he'd shown up on my doorstep rain-soaked and grinning. We sat at my small kitchen table like polite strangers, the weight of last night's confession settling between us like a third person we both refused to acknowledge. The morning light felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing every crack in the careful facade we'd built around 15 years of almosts and never quites. Julian's suitcase sat by the door like an accusation, zipped and ready, his laptop bag slung over the back of a chair. He'd cleared every trace of himself from my bathroom, collected his scattered clothes, even washed his coffee mug, and placed it back in the cabinet where it had lived before he'd claimed it as his own. It was as if the past month had been erased, edited out of existence, leaving only the ghost impression of disrupted routines and the lingering scent of his cologne on my pillowcase. I watched him over the rim of my mug, studying the familiar geography of his face in the harsh morning light. He looked tired, older somehow, like the wine and honesty had aged him overnight. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hair stuck up at odd angles from a night spent not sleeping. He kept glancing toward the door, then back at me, then at his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as if he couldn't decide whether he wanted to run or stay or disappear entirely. The silence stretched between us, comfortable and unbearable in equal measure. We'd always been good at quiet, Julian and I, but this was different. This was the silence of things that needed to be said but might never be, of last chances slipping away like water through cupped hands. I found myself memorizing details I'd taken for granted. The way he absently traced the rim of his mug with one finger, how his left eyebrow lifted slightly when he was thinking, the particular shade of brown in his eyes that changed depending on the light. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that might have been regret. "You're brave, Caleb." I wasn't. The words hung in the air between us, part compliment and part confession, and I felt something inside me snap. Not break, snap, like a rubber band stretched too far, like 15 years of swallowing my truth finally reaching its limit. I set down my coffee cup with deliberate care, the ceramic clicking against the saucer with finality. "You still aren't," I said, and the words came out steadier than I'd expected, carrying a weight I hadn't known I possessed. Julian flinched slightly, as if I'd struck him, but I wasn't finished. I'd spent too many years being careful with his feelings, protecting him from the inconvenience of my honesty, and suddenly I was tired of it, bone-deep exhausted by the effort of making myself smaller to fit into the spaces he was willing to give me. He stood then, pushing back from the table with the restless energy of someone who'd rather be anywhere else, doing anything other than having this conversation. He moved to the window, hands shoved deep in his pockets, shoulders set in that particular way that meant he was preparing for impact. When he turned back to me, his expression was carefully arranged, the mask of someone seeking absolution. "Caleb, I never meant to hurt you." The words were meant to be gentle, I think, a peace offering wrapped in good intentions. But they landed like stones, heavy and insufficient, and I found myself standing too, facing him across the small space of my kitchen like we were opponents rather than friends preparing to say goodbye. "But you did," I said, and there it was, the truth I'd been too polite, too afraid, too hopeful to speak for 15 years. "You hurt me every time you pretended not to see what was right in front of you. Every time you let me believe I was imagining things, that I was crazy for thinking there might be something more between us. You hurt me by knowing and choosing silence, by taking my love like it was your due, while giving me just enough attention to keep me hoping." Julian's face went very still, and I saw him flinch again, saw the careful composure crack around the edges. "Good," I thought with a savagery that surprised me. "Let him feel a fraction of what I've carried all these years." "I can't keep being the place you visit when your life feels too small," I continued, the words pouring out now like water through a broken dam. "I can't keep being your safety net, your comfortable backup plan, the friend who'll always be here waiting when you need someone to remember who you used to be. I won't do it anymore." The apartment fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic beginning to build on the street below. Julian stared at me like he'd never seen me before, like I'd transformed into someone unrecognizable, and maybe I had. Maybe this was who I'd always been underneath the careful politeness, the patient understanding, the willingness to accept whatever scraps of affection he was willing to offer. He opened his mouth as if to argue, to explain, to offer some defense of his choices, but then seemed to think better of it. Instead, he nodded slowly, a gesture that might have been acceptance or surrender or simple acknowledgement that some truths couldn't be argued with. "I'm sorry," he said finally, and this time he meant it. I could hear it in the raw honesty of his voice. But sorry wasn't enough, not anymore. Sorry was what you said when you accidentally stepped on someone's foot, not when you spent 15 years stepping on their heart. He collected his things with the same methodical precision he'd used to pack, slinging his laptop bag over his shoulder, gripping the handle of his suitcase with white knuckles. At the door, he paused, hand on the knob, and for a moment I thought he might turn around, might find the courage that had eluded him for so long. But then the moment passed, and he opened the door and stepped through it, taking with him the last of my illusions about what we might have been. The apartment felt enormous after he left, like a museum of empty spaces and abandoned possibilities. His absence was louder than his presence had ever been, a silence that echoed off walls that had grown used to accommodating two people's worth of dreams and disappointments. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the place where he'd been, waiting for the familiar ache of loss to settle in my chest. But something unexpected happened instead. As the minutes passed and the reality of his departure sank in, I felt something I hadn't expected: clarity. Clean, sharp, and strangely liberating. For the first time in 15 years, I knew exactly where I stood. Not in the gray space of maybe and almost, not in the purgatory of hope deferred, but on solid ground of my own making. I walked to my desk and pulled out a fresh sketchbook, one I'd been saving for something important, something worthy. For once, I didn't draw Julian's face or hands or the curve of his shoulders in lamplight. Instead, I drew myself, not as I'd been, caught between longing and fear, but as I was becoming. Someone who could speak truth even when it hurt. Someone who could choose dignity over desire. Someone who could love without losing himself in the process. The sketch wasn't perfect, the proportions slightly off, the shading not quite right. But it was mine in a way that none of my art had been before, honest and uncompromising and real. I stared at it for a long time. This version of myself I was still learning to recognize, and felt something settle into place that had been displaced for so long I'd forgotten what wholeness felt like. The apartment was quiet around me, but it wasn't the hollow silence of absence. It was the deep quiet of someone finally, completely alone with themselves, and finding that solitude not empty, but full of possibility. The weeks that followed Julian's departure unfolded like pages turning in a book I was finally ready to read. I woke to morning light that seemed brighter somehow, filtering through windows I'd opened wide to let in October air that smelled of leaves and possibility. The apartment, once a carefully controlled space designed to manage loneliness, became something different, a home rather than a hiding place, a canvas for the life I was learning to paint with broader strokes. I stopped apologizing for things that didn't require apologies. When the grocery store clerk seemed impatient with my careful selection of produce, I didn't rush or offer unnecessary explanations. When my mother called to ask why I sounded different, I told her I was learning to take up the space I'd always been afraid to claim. When clients questioned my creative choices, I explained my vision with confidence rather than defensive justification. Small changes, perhaps, but they accumulated into something larger, a way of moving through the world that felt authentic rather than apologetic. The sketch I'd drawn of myself after Julian left had become a kind of talisman, tucked into the corner of my easel where I could see it while I worked. It wasn't a flattering drawing. My proportions were still slightly off, the shading uneven in places, but it captured something true about the person I was becoming. Someone who could look directly at himself without flinching. Someone who could sit with discomfort without immediately trying to fix it or smooth it over with false optimism. I started painting again, really painting, not just the commercial illustrations that paid the bills, but work that came from someplace deeper and more honest. The canvases that had leaned against my walls for months, abandoned mid-brushstroke, suddenly revealed their potential. I finished a series of cityscapes painted from my fire escape, views of the neighborhood I'd lived in but never really seen, familiar streets transformed by attention and intention. The work was different from anything I'd done before, bolder and more immediate, as if my brush had learned to move without my permission. My morning routine changed too. Instead of rushing through coffee and checking emails before I was fully awake, I allowed myself to emerge slowly into each day. I sat by the window with my sketchbook, drawing whatever caught my eye. Pigeons negotiating the narrow spaces between buildings, the way shadows fell across the opposite rooftop, the particular quality of light that existed only in the hour after sunrise. These drawings weren't meant for anyone else, weren't portfolio pieces or potential commissions. They were conversations between me and the world, quiet acknowledgments of presence and attention. The bed, that narrow mattress that had once felt like both sanctuary and prison, became simply a place to sleep. I made it carefully each morning, smoothing sheets that no longer held the ghost impression of someone else's body, arranging pillows that knew only my own weight. The ritual felt intentional rather than obsessive, a daily practice of tending to my own space with the same care I'd once reserved for managing other people's comfort. 3 weeks after Julian left, I found the note. I was looking for a book I'd lent him, or thought I had, pulling volumes from the shelf with the systematic determination of someone who'd run out of other ways to procrastinate. The note fluttered to the floor like a leaf, folded once and tucked between pages I must have handled dozens of times without noticing. My name was written on the outside in Julian's familiar handwriting, the letters carefully formed in the way he wrote when he wanted something to be permanent. You were always the bravest person I knew. I just wish I'd told you then. No signature, no date, no return address or phone number. Just those 2 sentences that managed to carry both acknowledgement and regret, recognition and goodbye. I read it 3 times before the words fully registered, then stood holding it in my kitchen, afternoon light streaming through windows I'd forgotten to close, wondering when he'd hidden it there and why. The note should have reopened wounds I'd been learning to tend, should have sent me spiraling back into the familiar patterns of hope and analysis and what if. Instead, I felt something I hadn't expected, gratitude. Not for the words themselves, though they were generous in their own way, but for their timing. For weeks ago, finding this note would have been like receiving water in the desert, precious and transformative and potentially devastating in its power to make me believe in possibilities that didn't exist. Now, it felt like a period at the end of a very long sentence, the final punctuation in a story that had needed an ending. I folded the note carefully and placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, not hiding it, but putting it somewhere safe and contained. It belonged to the past now, to the version of myself who'd needed Julian's validation to feel real, who'd measured his own worth by the attention of someone who'd never been able to give what was really being asked for. This new version of myself, the one who could wake up alone and feel grateful rather than lonely, who could paint from curiosity rather than longing, didn't need Julian's belated recognition to know his own value. The apartment settled into new rhythms as autumn deepened into something sharper and more decisive. I bought plants, actual living things that required daily attention and care, and watched them transform my windows into small gardens of green possibility. I cooked elaborate meals for myself, not because I was trying to fill empty time, but because I discovered I enjoyed the alchemy of transforming simple ingredients into something nourishing and beautiful. I invited people over, colleagues, neighbors, the artist who lived 2 floors up and whose late-night music I'd been hearing for months without ever introducing myself. My work improved in ways that surprised me. The paintings I'd finished since Julian left carried a confidence and immediacy that my earlier work had lacked, as if removing the filter of unspoken longing had allowed me to see color more clearly, to understand the relationship between light and shadow in ways I'd never quite grasped before. When Professor Martinez emailed to invite me to show a few pieces in a group exhibition, I said yes without the usual spiral of self-doubt and imposter syndrome. The work was good, I knew it was good, and I didn't need anyone else's permission to believe that. December arrived quietly, bringing with it the kind of clear, cold light that made everything appear newly defined. I woke one morning to find snow beginning to fall outside my windows, large flakes that caught the early light and transformed the familiar cityscape into something magical and temporary. The apartment felt warm and complete around me, filled with the evidence of a life being actively lived. Books opened to pages I was actually reading, easels set up with work in progress, kitchen counter scattered with the remains of last night's attempt at homemade bread. I made coffee and carried it back to bed, not because I was avoiding the day, but because I could, because my morning belonged to me and I could spend it however I chose. The sheets were soft and warm, the pillows arranged exactly as I liked them, and sunlight poured through the windows I'd learned to keep uncovered, painting golden rectangles across the white expanse of my comforter. Lying there, watching snow fall past my windows, I thought about the person I'd been when Julian first appeared on my doorstep, rain-soaked and grinning. That version of myself had been waiting, for Julian to love him back, for life to begin in earnest, for permission to want things openly and without apology. This version, the one who could lie in bed on a snowy morning and feel complete rather than incomplete, had stopped waiting, had learned the difference between solitude and loneliness, between loving someone and losing yourself in that love. The note from Julian remained in my bedside drawer, folded and forgotten most days, occasionally rediscovered when I was looking for reading glasses or phone chargers. It had become simply another object in my life, no more or less significant than old birthday cards or expired warranties. Evidence of a time that had been important but was no longer defining. Sometimes I thought about Julian, wondered where he was and whether he'd found whatever he'd been looking for when he left. But these thoughts came without the old ache, without the particular pain of unfinished business. He'd become a character in stories I told about my younger self, someone who'd played an important role in my becoming but was no longer necessary to my being. The snow fell harder as the morning progressed, transforming the city into something hushed and contemplative. I finished my coffee and set the empty mug on the bedside table, then settled back against my pillows to watch the world disappear under white. The apartment was quiet around me, but it wasn't the hollow silence of emptiness. It was the deep quiet of someone who'd learned to be alone without being lonely, who discovered that wholeness was something you created from the inside out rather than something you found in another person's attention. I'd always imagined love would come like thunder, sudden and overwhelming, impossible to ignore or deny. But lying there in the gentle light of a snow-covered morning, I realized I'd been wrong about that too. Sometimes love came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic revelation. Sometimes the most profound transformation happened not in moments of passion or grand gesture, but in the simple daily practice of learning to be kind to yourself, to tend your own heart with the same care you'd once reserved for someone else's comfort. He'd always imagined love would come like thunder, but sometimes it leaves like a sigh.